Hello everyone. Now you will hear a brief retelling of the movie The Invasion. Enjoy the movie. Carol is attempting to swallow every medicine or energy drink she can find in order to keep her body awake while deadly forces continue to knock on a door, attempting to reach her. This shambles began a few days ago. A space shuttle explodes on its route down to Earth, scattering its fragments across various states in the United States. All media sources quickly cover the story, claiming that it is evidence of an extraterrestrial invasion. Most people grow afraid and avoid touching the wreckage, but there are still many opportunists who sell what they can rescue on eBay. Tucker, the director of the Centers for Disease Control, arrives at one of the crash sites for examination and discovers that a piece of wreckage is loaded with a mystery creature capable of withstanding massive amounts of radiation. The bacteria may also proliferate quickly, indicating that it is from another world. Tucker unintentionally brushes a small bit of debris on his way out, resulting in a scratch on his finger, but he ignores it and continues on his journey. Tucker returns home later that evening to discover his dog snarling at him before ignoring him for no apparent reason. Tucker's body begins to sweat abundantly, and he gets acute cellular condensation on his face as he goes to bed, as if something has taken over him. Meanwhile, Tucker's ex-wife Carol is awakened by her son Oliver's screams as a result of a nightmare. She runs to his room to wake him up and remains with him for the rest of the night to soothe him. Tucker calls Carol the next morning, requesting to see his kid, which is unusual for him. Carol declines and hangs off the phone. Carol then takes Oliver off at school and heads to her workplace, where she works as a psychiatrist. On her way there, she meets her closest friend Ben, who offers to drive her. Ben is a doctor, and he tells Carol that the government is keeping something important from them, as all of the researchers at the accident site have quit. Carol is not in the mood for politics and instead complains about Tucker, mentioning how he has been acting strangely recently and how he suddenly wants to visit their kid after being away for 4 years. Carol meets her first patient, Wendy, who relates that her husband has been acting strangely recently. He arrived at their house a few days earlier, and the dog, who is generally a sweet guy, began snarling at him for no apparent reason, and her husband simply murdered the unfortunate creature without expressing any emotion. Carol quickly recognizes that something is awry, but for the time being, she just prescribes a new medication for Wendy. Carol and her neighbor take their children trick-or-treating in the evening. When they approach a certain house, the family dog begins barking incessantly, despite the fact that the owner insists it's a fine pet the rest of the time. The gang attempts to flee, but the dog leaps at one of the boys and tackles him to the ground. The youngster, on the other hand, does not appear to be bothered, and instead squeezes the dog's lips with his bare hands until the owner arrives to take the dog away. The youngster has been injured, yet he maintains his poker face. The party then heads to Carol's house, where the boys split the candy as the neighbor confesses that her son has been acting strangely the previous several days, almost as if he has lost his feelings. Suddenly, Oliver screams from another room, and when Carol goes to him, she discovers a bizarre chunk of flesh coming out of his hand, which he obtained from the candy. Carol notices a distressed woman rushing through the streets the next morning but ignores her. She brings the odd meat to Ben, who gives it to his scientific buddy Stephen. He pledges to check into it, but the testing will take some time. Meanwhile, a mystery virus has begun to spread throughout the country, causing several deaths every day, but no one knows what is causing it. Soon after, an emergency conference is organized in the Capitol, during which Tucker explains that the new virus is spreading at an unprecedented rate, and that if nothing is done to stop it, the country would plunge into recession. When other researchers inquire about a possible remedy, Tucker states that the only way to halt the spread is to implement an immunization campaign. Meanwhile, several sick waiters vomit directly into the tea that would be served to the visitors. Carol witnesses a homeless man suffering a seizure on the streets after leaving the hospital, but unlike the scared lady, he is being assisted. Carol arrives at her workplace to discover Wendy's husband there, and he refuses to go until he sees his wife. He also never expresses any emotion when speaking. Carol warns Wendy and prevents her from entering the building, so Wendy instead takes a taxi to stay with her sister. Carol hesitantly agrees to allow Oliver to spend time with Tucker later that night because it is his right as the parent. Carol slaps the brakes barely in time as a scared woman appears in the middle of the road on their approach to Tucker's residence. The lady begs for assistance, insisting that something awful will happen shortly, but before she can further, a vehicle runs her over. Carol notes the driver maintains a poker face throughout the horrific collision, and when the authorities come, she instantly wants to testify against him. Carol thinks it strange that the chief officer merely advises her to go home since they have this covered. Carol sets Oliver off at Tucker's apartment, seeing her ex's face is devoid of emotion as she walks away. Following that, she meets Ben for a very elegant party, where they have a highly philosophical chat with diplomat Belisek, his wife Ludmila, and Dr. Urish. Ben brings Carol home after the party and attempts to kiss her, but Carol quickly breaks the kiss because she doesn't want to destroy their friendship. Carol sends Oliver a message once inside and then hears someone at the door. She just opens it a little and discovers a man asking Census Department questions, which doesn't make sense at this hour. Carol tries to shut the door in his face, but he puts his hand inside, resulting in a battle between the two of them. Carol eventually triumphs and locks the door, leading the intruder to flee. Meanwhile, Oliver gets to play with his friend Jean, who claims that his father is acting strangely, and Oliver believes the same of his own father. When Oliver returns home, he discovers Tucker preparing a special drink for him. Carol witnesses a number of individuals on the streets the next morning with blank expressions on their faces, almost as if their soul has been stolen away. When she arrives at her office, she discovers that all of her clients have canceled their appointments for the day. Carol tries to call Wendy, but her husband answers the phone and says everything is okay. Carol considers all she's witnessed and concludes the virus is manipulating humans. When she starts browsing some information about it, she is shocked by her secretary, who offers her some tea. Carol receives a call from Ben, who informs her that the test results for the unusual skin patch are available. Carol rushes to the lab, where Stephen reveals that the skin sample contains numerous molecular spores that take over the human brain during sleep and change the genetic code, making a person unstable. This implies that they are not allowed to sleep until they find a treatment for the fatal virus. Ludmila then phones Ben to inform him that Urish has been acting oddly. Carol witnesses the large lines on the streets where people are waiting to get vaccinated against the new illness, which prompts the trio to race to his house. When they get to Urish, they discover him in bed, his body undergoing a horrible change. Carol attempts to photograph him, but the monster-like guy awakens and assaults her. Ben pulls Urish away swiftly, forcing him to drag his body away before vomiting a strange substance and dying. Carol hurries to Tucker's house to pick up Oliver since she is concerned about her kid being exposed to this disaster. When she arrives, Tucker is in a meeting with his partners, and she quickly inquires about her kid. Tucker claims that Oliver is playing at Jean's, but Carol does not believe him and begins searching the home for Oliver. At that time, the guys from the conference surround Carol, who becomes terrified and attempts to flee, but Tucker pushes her to the ground and infects her with his saliva. Carol, fortunately, manages to shove him away and flees through the back door. She tries to enlist the assistance of her neighbors, but they are also affected. Then she gets to her car, only to find the road blocked on both sides, causing her to crash. When she gets out of her car, she is pursued by a bunch of infected individuals, so she walks to the main street and asks for aid. Because everyone is ignoring her, she chooses to enter a metro station. Carol boards the train and discovers that it is full with folks with the same hazy looks. Her phone calls at that time, and she receives a message from Oliver, who urges her to help him since Tucker has hidden him someplace. Carol is on the verge of a nervous breakdown when one of the passengers explains that he isn't infected, everyone is acting emotionless so that the infected people would ignore them, and he tells her to do the same. When a gang of infected persons suddenly enters the wagon, Carol and the remaining sane passengers rush to the train's terminus and seal the entrance. The infected ones hit the emergency button to bring the train to a halt before busting down the door and infecting the passengers, so Carol unlocks the back door and gets off the wagon, fleeing down the tunnel until she reaches the station's locker room. There, she discovers a guard's gun, and as the guard approaches her, she becomes too afraid and accidentally shoots him. Carol, terrified, lowers the revolver and crosses the station, pretending to be infected with a poker face. When she returns to the street, she sees several officers arresting uninfected civilians and forcing them to take the vaccine, which is Tucker's plan to spread the infection to everyone. At that point, an uninfected officer spots Carol's perspiration and warns her to leave swiftly since the sweat would reveal her identity. Carol begins to walk away when she collides with her neighbor, who offers her the shot. Carol's acting, fortunately, convinces her that she has already received the vaccination. Afterward, Carol goes to Tucker's house, only to find it empty. She goes out again, leaving a note for Oliver, and finds a crowd watching a couple finish things for themselves. Carol keeps walking until she reaches the Belasek estate, where Ben and Stephen are still doing some tests. After some deliberation, Ben chooses to aid Carol in finding her kid, while Stephen and his assistant prepare to drive to Fort Detrick in Maryland in search of a viral cure. They also resolve to stay up, fearful that if they sleep, they would become sick. Belasek returns at that time, and Ludnell embraces him, but Belasek is diseased and concerned about future intruders, so he allows a swarm of guards inside. Carol and the others, fortunately, observe this on the security cameras and flee through the back door. When they reach the streets, they see Wendy being dragged away by infected officers. She attempts to fight them, shouting that she slept and was still okay, but the officers knock her out nevertheless. Carol and Ben discuss Wendy's statements after the group divides and conclude that Wendy has gained an immunity to the virus. The duo then discovers a dead officer on the ground, so they steal his car and drive to Carol's office, where they begin studying Wendy's medical history. Ben discovers that Wendy was suffering from encephalitis, which is why she's immune. The virus only attacks healthy brains in order to feed and grow its numbers. While Carol receives another text from Oliver indicating that he is being detained at his grandmother's home in Baltimore, Ben phones Stephen at the lab to offer him this new information. Carol, terrified, admits to Ben that she has already been infected with the virus, but Ben assures her that everything will be okay. Following that, Ben drives like a crazy to the city, passing blocked highways until he is forced to let Carol go so that the cops may follow him instead. Carol keeps walking, and when a cop approaches her, she shows her ID with a poker face and is let go. Carol eventually arrives at the station and catches a train to Baltimore, where she hides in the restroom. The lack of sleep is beginning to affect her, and she begins to have visions, such as seeing a second self in the mirror that wants to harm her. She wakes up just in time, and after washing away a piece of that strange flesh, she opens the door to find Gene, who explains he lost his family and now he's part of hers. He keeps begging her to sleep, and Carol claims she will, but only in private. When the train arrives in Baltimore, Gene checks on her again and discovers her pulling additional flesh bits from her body, which makes him suspicious. Tucker arrives to accompany Carol and Gene to his mother's house, trusting Carol's heartless performance. Carol continues to act around the family, and when she receives a call from Ben, she pretends to be her secretary and speaks in code. Carol takes advantage of Tucker's absence to investigate the home and eventually discovers Oliver in a room. Carol tries to slip to the door as he speaks like a horrible villain, but Tucker catches her from behind and tries to knock her unconscious. Tucker grabs Oliver instead when he cuts in and beats his father with a metal implement. This allows Carol to punch him in the head and knock him unconscious, allowing them to go. Carol and Oliver then hide inside an empty department shop. Carol explores the medication cabinet and discovers an injection, which she displays to Oliver while explaining that she wants him to inject it into her heart if she ever falls asleep. They then leave in search of food when Carol receives a call from Ben, who learns of their whereabouts and offers to pick them up shortly. While his mother is on the phone, Oliver hesitantly approaches a blood-splattered door, but Carol stops him before he can open it. Instead, she enters within herself and discovers a number of others on the ground undergoing the transition. Carol gently approaches the officer to remove his pistol before going outside and closing the door, instructing Oliver to keep away from it. While they wait for Ben, hours pass, and while Oliver sleeps, Carol urgently seeks for anything she can use to remain awake, returning to the beginning of the narrative. Unfortunately, this is insufficient, and Carol falls asleep regardless. The infected persons within the room eventually wake up and begin banging the door in an attempt to escape. The commotion awakens Oliver up, and he realizes her mother has fallen asleep, so he injects her with a syringe right away, waking her up and canceling the transition just in time. Carol then wipes the strange flesh off her face and exits the restroom, only to realize Ben has come. She runs to hug him, only to discover that he, too, has been infected. Carol steps back as Ben asks her to join the new society that will be free of crime, hatred, and intolerance. Carol aims her rifle at him, but Ben still unlocks the door and allows all of the other infected individuals to go before adding that they despise immunity while pointing at Oliver. Carol continues firing swiftly, killing them one by one as the group rushes to catch the youngster. She can't bring herself to murder Ben, so she shoots him in the leg and flees with Oliver. Outside, they steal Ben's car in order to flee. Carol receives a call from Steven, who provides her an address where a chopper will be waiting for them. When she reaches the main street, she is besieged by automobiles, and she crashes, losing consciousness. Many infected individuals have gathered around the automobile, and Oliver locks the doors before shaking Carol awake. Carol hurries up and pushes the folks aside to flee after a guy breaks a window and infects them. Carol drives like a lunatic and intentionally strikes objects to make them fall because there are still a few wild ones hanging on the roof of the car. There are also cop vehicles pounding her car until she crashes, sending the remaining several assailants flying into a shop window. Fortunately, the automobile is intact, and Carol continues driving while calling Steven for directions. An agitated guy throws a Molotov bomb at her car, but Carol continues to drive with the vehicle on fire, not stopping until they arrive at the correct building's parking area. Carol and Oliver emerge from the automobile when it collides with a pillar and rush to the elevator, where the enemy is closing in on them. They struck them and pushed them aside, which allowed the doors to close. The pair eventually makes it to the roof, where Steven and his army pals arrive in a chopper to rescue them. Scientists outside the United States eventually developed a vaccine, and the alien virus was wiped from the whole planet as a result, restoring normalcy to life. Steven, the vaccine's principal scientist, tells the press that inoculated persons would have no recollection of the previous occurrences. Carol, meanwhile, has adopted Jean and is now in a relationship with Ben. While the boys are getting ready for school, Ben reads the newspaper and remarks on the violent crimes done by humanity, which causes Carol to reflect about the aliens' promise of peace.